pleasure to introduce Leigh Peake, the convener of today's panel on broadening participation in citizen science and broadening participation in science. Leigh comes from a family of educators. One of her grandfathers ran a one-room school in rural Virginia. She started her own career in the classroom before shifting gears to become a successful educational publishing executive and entrepreneur. Among other accomplishments, Leigh spent 15 years at Heinemann Publishing, where she directed the work of 10 editors and developed one of the premier lines of professional resources and services for teachers. Leigh has brought all this expertise, commitment, and spirit to her current role as Chief Education Officer here at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. Leigh leads our education team's work with K-12 teachers and students in all corners of Maine, including some of the most rural areas of our nation. Our work is focused on providing middle school students with opportunities to participate in authentic science experiences that cultivate their critical thinking and understanding of the nature of science. This work has included citizen science for nearly 2 decades. And for the past 4 years, it's also included work funded by the NASA Science Activation Program. This support was instrumental in the revision of our Lab Venture program, a hands-on, interactive, authentic investigation of the changing Gulf of Maine ecosystem. With sponsorship from the Maine business community, this program annually serves nearly 70% of the state's 5th and 6th grade students. And Maine is a big state. Some of these students live in communities that are farther away from Portland than New York City is. NASA support has also brought us into a collaboration with a network of regional science education centers throughout New England to share our interactive approach to science and data learning. Leigh is uniquely prepared to take the lead on this panel, which has strong ties to some of her many passions, namely social justice and science, technology, engineering, and math education. She's pulled together a fantastic panel for us today. Leigh, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. So while we envisioned this panel months before the explosion of national attention on racial injustice in our country, that moment and its ongoing momentum has lit a new flame underneath us as organizers. We find ourselves in the context of a pandemic that uniquely impacts minority and poor communities, in an era where fake news has effectively politicized science and deteriorated trust in science, and in a collective mindset to question relationships between community and authority. In this moment, we feel inspired to have a conversation about the relationship between science and communities traditionally underrepresented by science or in science, particularly communities of color and indigenous communities. We want to think together about how to broaden participation of those communities in science and in citizen science. As citizen scientists, we also find ourselves optimistic about the unique promise of citizen science in this moment to articulate different kinds of questions, create pathways to new kinds of scientific discovery, and build new relationships between communities and science. This optimism is also energized by NASA Science Mission Directorate's emphasis on building a scientifically literate nation, and NASA Administrator Zurbuchen's challenge to increase the number of NASA citizen scientists by a factor of 10. Our panel today features experts who have been thinking about the challenge of broadening participation in science and in citizen science, and we've asked them to try to identify specific project design choices that have the potential to broaden or narrow participation in citizen science. So let's dive right in. Elena Sparrow is research professor and director of education and outreach for the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. She also directs the NASA-funded Arctic and Earth Signs Project, which engages youth, educators, and tribal elders together in investigations of local impacts of a warming Arctic. Elena, your project deliberately braids together understandings of climate change resulting from traditional knowledge and from Western science. Can you talk about the project design choices your team has made to be sure that braiding works and to be responsive to both elder and youth needs?
Yes, I'd love to. But I'd like to go back even before the braiding process is in designing the project itself. Uh, we need to establish a trusting relationship with someone from the community that we're trying to reach. And so in our case, it's indigenous peoples. from Alaska, the Alaska Natives, and then other tribes in outside of Alaska. And so, and then we invite this collaboration with a person that we have already established a relationship. And one thing uh, that is good to remember in any relationship is not to take each other for granted. And so, and then so we and we come to a consensus about and sometimes it's a push and pull about how we would do this co-production so that we, especially with indigenous communities, we're trying to overcome the history and the trauma of colonialism. And so we need to remember and be purposeful in what we want to do. So how can we have a meaningful experience for this group that we're wanting to reach? And in our case, so it starts with not only uh, the timing of the, you know, because of the subsistence calendars and schedules that are the participants participate in their own communities. We have to be mindful of that, because who are we excluding if we don't think about the timing? And then the teams that we invite. So we purposely invite educators and also community members and elders and youth leaders so that they will be able to engage the youth in their community. And there's different needs. The youth we know would like to engage them in STEM learning, and and how do we do that in a way that builds on the knowledge that they've been learning from their own elders and within their culture. And so then for the elders or community members, you know, what are their needs? And so we have done needs assessment to do that, as well as continually learning what's important to them. And so in the braiding process, the choice of that is we don't say we're integrating, because sometimes when we integrate components, sometimes one component is subsumed by another. And so the braiding is a really good analogy where you can see the different strands. And also it's a good analogy for sometimes when we braid too tightly, you know, you kind of say, ouch, it's, you know, we need to let go of something. And so, you know, kind of loosen up and sometimes rebraid. And so at the start of the so how do we give them voices so that we uh, uh, go on this journey together, and so that it's a reciprocal and not a one-way uh, uh, learning. And so we, from the beginning of the workshop, we have all participants introduce themselves the way that they want to, so that they know that they can express themselves and have a voice. Um, and then the other thing is we're braiding not just content, but also the process. So if we say that we're braiding multiple knowledge and ways of doing and knowing, which knowledge system do we honor first? So, uh, so we changed in the past. It's always been the Western ways of doing it and the Western science. And so we changed that and start with the indigenous knowledge. We do the land acknowledgement. We do the prayers that they're used to in starting gatherings and starting and in establishing a safe and trusting place to be able to share. And then we also model for them. We work under some guiding principles, and we start with the principles from the First Alaskans Institute, and we start with a few, and then participants can add on to that. For example, you know, in each seat there is a leader, and respect and reciprocity is going to be the norm. And also, if you are uh, staying too quiet, uh, ask yourself, that you need to be able to share, because some people will learn from you. And if you're talking too much, then you also say, maybe it's time for me to stay quiet so that then I can learn from others. And uh, so in all these things that we do during the uh, uh, course that we offer, the climate change in my community, we start with what they know about the impacts of climate change in their own community and combining it. And citizen science in the form of the GLOBE program, the Global Learning Observations to Benefit the Program, the environment, comes as a handy tool for youth, because they're very interested in helping, doing some action in their community. Now our youth are very active, especially not only in Alaska, I know, but worldwide. But in Alaska, our youth are also, and our indigenous youth are very articulate in about climate change and actions that can be done, and wanting community members and elders and leaders in the community to be involved. And so we're trying to meet that need. And for elders, they want to be able to have some tools to uh, put into place some adaptation methods. And so that's where the citizen science tools comes in. And they have a choice of, depending on what the issues they're facing in their community, whether it's the precipitation lack of or too much precipitation, or the thawing of permafrost. And so there is a whole um, set of measurements that are available to them. And so when we braid, we also constantly check with each other in the team. And we're very fortunate to have Melinda Chase, who is the leader of the Association of Interior Native Educators, as well as a tribal liaison between the Alaska tribes and the uh, this Alaska Adaptation Climate Science Adaptation Center.
That's great, Elena. Thank you so much. All right, Laura. Laura Trouille is Vice President of Science Engagement and Visualization at the Adler Planetarium, which is one of my favorite places, I have to say. Laura is also co-PI of the Zooniverse platform, funded in part by NASA, with over 100 active projects and 2 million participants around the world. It's one of the largest platforms for people-powered research. The projects on Zooniverse range from classifying faraway galaxies to transcribing historical handwritten documents to tagging animals in their natural habitats. So Laura, Zooniverse has more people contributing to research than any other platform. So obviously you've got some lessons to share about broadening participation. What can platform and project designers replicate from Zooniverse's approach to engagement?
First, just thank you. I've really appreciated this webinar series, and I deeply admire the work the other panelists are carrying out. So I'm going to strive to showcase opportunities through online citizen science in this space, but also very much draw attention to the efforts and issues that remain. So the image on the right shows the Zooniverse projects page with the nearly 100 active projects across the disciplines, each led by a different research team. The general model is the research team has images, audio clips, or video files that need to be processed, so classified, tagged, annotated, or marked in some way. And it's only through harnessing the power of the crowd that that effort becomes practical or possible. So specifically, each week, over 200,000 people contribute around 3 million classifications through Zooniverse projects. It's equivalent to 40 years of full-time effort Like Leigh said, discovering planets around distant stars, transcribing historical documents, marking cell structures for cancer research, and much more. So there are hundreds of projects to date, 2 million participants right now, and this is tremendous. First, I wanted to highlight some of the guiding principles that led to this, but then I want to dig into the areas where we falter and try to draw some lessons from those. So I'll note 3 guiding principles. So first, from our start over a decade ago, the Zooniverse has benefited from being a true partnership between a museum and universities. It's a marriage between the Adler Planetarium's expertise in engaging the public in science and the University of Oxford and Minnesota, their expertise and authenticity in research. So that guided our design and approach, putting on equal footing and priority the 2 audiences we're serving, so the public and the research community. For the research community, we needed, for example, to ensure data quality and reliability from the crowd. For the public, we hold central the trust that we've built with them, that their effort is valuable and meaningful, that we never waste their time, that the researchers commit to being present and responsive in each project's dedicated discussion forum, so that each project has a space to talk about the research, their interests, the weird things people see while they're classifying bugs, and so on. The community that's created between the public participants, the researchers, and the internal Zooniverse team is core to the Zooniverse. So the second principle is our design is guided by having as low a barrier to entry as possible and a high threshold of opportunity. So most projects are designed so that 5-year-olds to 95-year-olds can participate. Each project has a brief 1 to 2 minute tutorial describing the task, and anyone can dive right in. There's no special skills or expertise needed. And the high threshold is achieved through the discussion forums, where some of the most transformative discoveries have been made when participants flag the unusual or the rare, like a 4-star system with planets around it. And then they work alongside the researchers to analyze the data and explore the discovery. So dozens of our participants are co-authors on scientific publications, and all are acknowledged as contributors in the articles that come out through a link to the full list of participants. So third, related to this point about low barrier to entry, is that by being a single platform with 100 projects currently active, they all have a consistent layout and user experience. And so participants can move from project to project with relative ease. So for example, students participate in Snapshot Serengeti as part of a school project, but then they get exposed to a new area of science when they try out Gravity Spy, which is the same exact task type as Snapshot, but you're choosing among gravitational wave patterns rather than animal species. Or if participants who transcribe in our African American Civil War Soldiers project, because it's tied to their family history, and then through our e-newsletter, they hear about the HSL Cancer Research Project and have the confidence to participate because they first experienced a welcoming space in the African American Soldiers Project. So one of our design efforts underway is to improve the discoverability of projects within the platform by placing signposts about other projects directly within the classification interface itself. So now in this short sort of overview, I want to talk about where we struggle and draw lessons that I hope will have relevancy to other programs. So from our analytics, we get a sense for location, age, and gender of our participants. While we have participants in over 200 countries, half are US-based, 30% are in the UK or Europe, and 20% the rest of the world, with a much higher frequency in English-speaking countries. And so we're addressing this in 2 ways. One, we now have an interface to crowdsource translations to make projects more accessible to non-English speakers. And then 2, through intentional partnerships with research teams in non-US European countries, really providing them the support to use our tools. In terms of age, half our participants are 34 years old and younger, and the other half are over 35. It's a pretty flat distribution throughout, and it's a relatively equal split between 52% male and 48% female, which is promising for a online science platform. Sophia Liu of the USGS brought up in a previous webinar that online citizen science platforms have a significant population of people who are neurodivergent, for example, on the autism spectrum. And as she noted, they bring a valuable skill set to that type of project. But for us, that's tied to a broader issue around how we don't provide training to research teams around moderation in general and participation in their discussion forums. And included in that shortcoming is we don't currently provide training and support of online discussion forums with neurodivergent communities. So there's a real opportunity for groups with that kind of expertise to partner with citizen science platforms like ours and help us in providing that kind of training. We don't have recent results on race or ethnicity. When people sign in, all they put in is their email address. But what I'll note about the research teams and institutions we engage with next will speak to this point a little bit more broadly. So what do we know about research teams leading Zooniverse projects? The plot on the slide shows the growth in our platform since the first project in 2007. And you can see a sharp increase in 2015 when we launched the Project Builder platform. So it's a simple browser-based interface researchers use to drop in their data, set the task type, and apply for review. Tens of thousands of our volunteers serve as beta reviewers and help vet and refine the projects before a public launch. So we went from launching 3 custom-built projects each year to launching over 60 projects last year because of the Project Builder. So we started in a niche research space and have grown tremendously quickly over the past few years. But we've relied on word of mouth, presentations at conferences, and our existing networks to share knowledge of Zooniverse as a research tool. And so despite the Project Builder being open and free for all, most projects are led by predominantly white institutions rich in resources in the US, UK, and the European Union. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that and then think about what that means. An example of where we want to head is the model showcased by a project on Zooniverse called Transcribe Cooper. So this is a project led by the Colored Conventions Group based at the University of Delaware. It's focused on social justice activism and research. So our Zooniverse Digital Humanities lead built a relationship with this group over a few years and helped them build their project. Their Douglas Day Transcribe-a-thon with over 50 minority serving institutions participating this year was a tremendous success. But I'll note that that project, as an example, relied on an individual within our team developing relationships and following through. And so instead, our goal as an organization, and I think a lesson for all of organizations of our type, is to prioritize showing up in spaces outlined by minority serving institutions, community colleges, and others, and listen and see if our tools can serve their efforts and goals, and then support them in the efforts that they're driving. So as an organization and in our general operations, we are striving to and we need to meet communities where they are, rather than waiting for them to come to us or relying on our existing networks. So there's a tremendous opportunity within our citizen science community to continue learning from one another and see where there's complementarity, where lessons can be generalized, where resources can be shared. And so I look forward to the Q&A and just hearing more from my fellow panelists and the audience.
Thanks, Laura. That's great. And we're hearing a lot about partnerships and relationships, so I bet that's going to come up in the Q&A as well. Sacoby Wilson is Associate Professor of Applied Environmental Health at the University of Maryland School of Public Health. He has over 10 years experience working in community university partnerships on environmental health and justice issues. Sacoby also heads up the Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health Lab at the university, focused on investigating the impact of multiple intersecting pollutants on differentially exposed populations and underserved communities. Sacoby, I know your work focuses on leveraging community-based participatory research approach and principles of community-owned and managed research. I've been wondering, is that an all or nothing proposition? Meaning, if a project wasn't designed from the start with that at its core, is it sort of hopeless? Or are there some critical adaptive moves that a project manager could make to strengthen the work with communities?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the question. I think to kind of go back a little bit, I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the community engagement continuum. But on this continuum that I use in my work, we have outreach, consultation, involvement, participatory and driven. And so as you move from left to right, trust increases, communication increases, sort of action increases. So as was said earlier about other panelists, you know, with partnerships, you have to think about what makes those partnerships great. Same thing that makes relationships great. You have to have trust, you have to have communication, You have to have some Aretha Franklin. So respect is really, really important, right? You're going to have openness, transparency. And so for me, in the work that I do, when we do this work with communities, you know, I try to stay within the participatory and community-driven side of that continuum. And I mean, I think just to kind of go back a little bit more, you know, the reasons why it's important for this work to be community-driven, a lot of communities I work in, they're dealing with baggage issues, right? They've had academic institutions that have done work on them, not with them, not for them. And science has been extractive. You know, science where data's been collected and nothing's been done to actually solve the problem. I mean, putting this in the context of where we are with the pandemics or the syndemic of, you know, COVID-19 and racism and economic apartheid in this country. You know, it's important to note that a lot of communities we're talking about, they're dealing with multiple issues at one time. And so they've had universities who've done research again on them, but not with them, not for them, not by them. So you have to really, to do co-created science, it's important to understand that baggage. And so what's the why? Why would a community want to get engaged with you in a project? It's to solve a problem. And so for me, my philosophy is all about doing science that acts. Discovery science is great, but in the communities that I work in, discovery science ends up being pain pimping. You're pimping people's pain. So how are you actually doing science that actually solves the problem? So whether it be social problems, economic problems, health problems. So it's important to have that undergird the project, like be anchored in understanding those issues in that context. And so, you know, I don't think a project would fail if it's not co-created or community driven, but there has to be, you know, iterative process where you're getting that feedback from community members, community leaders, and participants. And so, you know, I do a lot of work in community. So, for example, one community partner I work with since 2007 is the Low Country Alliance for Model Communities. They're a community-based organization based in North Charleston, South Carolina. And North Charleston is not as well known as Charleston because everybody knows Charleston for various reasons, you know, tourist reasons. But North Charleston is where a lot of the what we call goods movement activities occur. So the Port of Charleston, you know, you have transfer of cargo goods from the port onto intermodal vehicles. Then those goods are moved into rail traffic and truck traffic. This community hosts multiple Superfund sites, has leaking underground storage tanks, has brownfields, as metal recyclers, some of the typical kind of profiles you see communities that have basically been used to sacrifice zones, right? And so with that community partnership, you know, it started out as I was invited in because the community group has a mitigation agreement with the Port Authority. And so I was brought in to help with environmental monitoring. And from that, we got an NIH grant to build a community university partnership. And so we, as part of the partnership building process, we followed some of the principles of partnership outlined by Community Campus Partnership for Health, CCPH. We also relied on EJ principles. You know, one of the EJ principles, affirmative principles, community speaks for its own voice. This is really, really important. And one of the frameworks that we use to try to take the data that's collected and transfer to action is the US EPA's collaborative problem solving model. So it's all about, you know, what are the issues, what are the priorities, doing consensus building, knowing there may be tension, doing conflict resolution between partners, and then again, trying to make the data walk and talk, really moving that to action. And so I think when you're trying to do these projects, particularly place-based projects, it's really important to make sure those voices are at the table to lead the work. And mistakes will be made with that partnership. You know, I made a mistake early on in making it like y'all should fight back and do this, and the community was really against it. So I put both feet in my mouth because I thought I learned from this other partnership that I worked in for a while. Like this is the best approach, but you know, one size doesn't fit all. You know, so and I think even if you're working in a Black community previously on similar issues, you can go to a different Black community and those methods, you know, may not work. So you have to be able to modify your methodology to fit the context. And so what's been great about that partnership, even though over time, you know, the research intensity has changed, we've all had the same why and trying to make sure that we mitigate the negative impacts of port expansion and related activities and maximize the benefits in that community. So as part of our work, you know, we train residents to do air quality monitoring using federal reference method monitors. We train residents collect their own soil samples to look for a suite of different metals, from arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, chromium, lead, and others. We had an education campaign called Project Excellence, which is all about empowerment. And I didn't say empowerment with an EM, I said empowerment. So the whole idea is, you know, I've been schooled by community leaders, community mentors. Sacoby, you can't give us power, but help us connect to the power that we already have. Help us actualize that power. Help us use science to actualize our power, right? And so that was important part. We had workshops on monitoring, workshops on pollution issues, workshops on health disparities. We engaged youth. We had a summer program, engaged young folks, really thinking about what we call critical environmental literacy, critical environmental health literacy. So it's just not enough to educate folks, but how do you help them build a capacity so they can have more agency to address the issue? So that's really, really important part of the work that we do. And more recently, we're helping them to use low-cost sensors to measure pollutants like particulate matter and other pollutants that are related to that community. And so part of the partnership, we were able to shut down the incinerator. We were able to stop them from building a recycling plant on top of the old incinerator site. We were able to use some of the data to translate to zoning changes. They've been able to get another mitigation agreement to mitigate some of the impacts related to activities, industrial activities in that community. So that's a real success. But there were some challenges, right? There's challenges in doing this kind of work where you have to make sure that, again, the community leads the effort. It's important to have an advisory board of stakeholders who really understand what's going on the ground. Sometimes funding can cause strife and cause conflict. So you have to have equity in funding. And that's a big issue when we think about science in general. We have to change how science is done. There's power differentials between institutions and community-based organizations. And so the fact that a community member may not have a PhD doesn't mean anybody can be a scientist. And for me, what's important is frontline, defense line community members, they are the real subject matter experts. I'm a generalist. I don't live in the EJ community, right? But the folks who live on the ground who are dealing with issues, you have to make sure that we're supporting, uplifting, and valuing that cultural knowledge, that community knowledge, those cultural knowledge systems. And that's an important part of community-based medicinal research. I mean, the whole history of CBPR comes from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Really talking, grounded in people and their voices driving the science. So, I mean, I think that's important for citizen science to be more, bottom up. And as much as possible, come to an agreement, whether it be through an MOU, for example. That's one way to figure out, how things can be done. And remember, we're in a relationship. It doesn't have to be forever. You have an MOU to say, hey, we're going to work on this project for a year, 2 years. And then after we get goals and objectives achieved, we end the project, and I do work in other communities besides in Charleston. I work with the Western Revitalization Association on something called the Community Owned and Managed Research Framework as a grad student with Omega Wilson and his folks, Brendan Wilson. And we were able to give some of the community members first-time installation of sewer and water infrastructure for the first time. These are communities, these are post-slavery Black communities that we call pre-New Deal communities. Still don't have the roads paved, right? They didn't have access to sewer and water infrastructure. Even though the sewage treatment plant, they hosted the sewage treatment plant. So they were impacted by the odors. They weren't connected to the sewer and water lines. We're doing work in Uniontown, Alabama, which is near Selma. So just think about this whole uprising against, systemic racism in this country. Uniontown is a community that's the per capita income, I think, is less than $12,000 a year. Okay, you talking about, so we have extreme poverty in this country, and it's, whether it be in the southern parts of the country, whether it be in with some of our tribal brothers and sisters on reservations, that's a big issue. In that community, they have a landfill that was built on top of an old old plantation and cemetery, old cemetery that takes in trash from 33 states. They also have 4 million tons of fly ash. They have a catfish processing plant, a cheese plant, and then unlike many of us, when we flush our toilets, our wastewater goes to a sewage treatment plant. Their wastewater goes to the containment pond. They spray human waste on fields. Okay, so we built a hyperlocal air quality monitoring network to help measure pollutants in that community. And again, it's important. And this work, we were invited in, right? So we didn't go there looking for it. Most of my work, I work with folks who want us, who invite us in. And that's really, really important, to not do helicopter science and not just swoop in, but doing science that's responsive to a need. Science is a means and a tool. Science is not an end, in my opinion. And so for me, in the work that I do, if science doesn't focus on action and social justice, and empowerment, it's incomplete science. I say that to my academic colleagues in the University of Maryland and others, because science, as we have done it in this country, needs to be transformed. Again, speaking about this uprising, all institutions have a reckoning. Our research industrial complex also has a reckoning to go through. Is our research industrial complex anti-racist? And one way to be anti-racist is to empower communities through science, and making sure that science is either community-driven or participatory. And I think that's an important way to engage more communities, to connect through STEM, to make sure that we're solving social problems. And by doing that, think about it. If you're doing science that, oh man, you're trying to solve problems in my community, guess what? You have young folks who want to do that science too. You have adults who want to do that science too. Because you made science more something that's tangible, they can connect to. It's not lofty and in the air, it's actually proximal, it's pocketbook, it's everyday. It's solving problems that are relevant to them. So I think that's really important, and that's why participatory science and community-driven science are important, because it's other communities for the community, by the community, and it's really about using science for action, science for community building, science for change. And that, I think that's a space that citizen science can really expand more in that way. And really, when you think about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, the whole JADA mission that we should have in science, that's a place for citizen science to be.
Thank you so much, Sacoby. I want to turn to Jane. Jane Anderson is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Museum Studies at New York University with a specialization in intellectual property law. She's also a co-founder of Local Contexts, which is an initiative to support Native, First Nations, Aboriginal, Metis, Inuit, and Indigenous communities in the management of intellectual property and cultural heritage. So Jane, you know, I've been inspired by your work on systems of data labels that denote essential characteristics of the context from which the data is derived, particularly traditional knowledge and biocultural labels. Can you describe that work a little bit and how your team is thinking about its relevance and application in citizen science?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited by the synergies across every panelist here and kind of what that conversation is going to be. I also want to begin by acknowledging that I'm here in New York, which is Lenape territory, Lenapehoking, and I want to begin by paying my respects to the ancestors and to the present and future generations of these lands. Local Contexts really is a set of digital tools that's connecting knowledge and data to people in place over time. It was developed around 8 years ago with Indigenous partnerships and collaborations, really to address kind of key problems in data and information infrastructures. So I want to just detail a couple of the problems that we are trying to address with Local Contexts, and then talk a little bit about the labels in terms of what they do and how they've been developed. So as has already kind of been pointed out, we are in a moment of reckoning, and partly in terms of thinking about how histories of research are embedded in histories of colonialism and what that means in relationship to the particular marginalization of particular people's knowledge and the devaluation of that. Because of histories of research and colonialism, Indigenous people have enormous collections of tangible and intangible cultural material, knowledge and data held in archives, libraries and museums, databases and other digital repositories around the world. But part of the problem here is that significant information about these collections, including individual and community names, proper provenance information, is missing. In almost all cases, the records that go with these collections are deeply impoverished because Indigenous people did not participate in the collection or were ever seen as being users of those collections into the future. So the other kind of dilemma that we deal with in this kind of context is that Indigenous peoples and communities are largely not the legal rights holders of any of this material. And what that means is that they're unable to make decisions about access and future use, and this compromises how that material can be used for Indigenous needs. So issues of responsibility and ownership, as well as the incomplete and significant mistakes in the metadata, actually continue into the digital lives of this material. So as material from museums and libraries gets digitized, and as more data comes into these spaces, these problems get perpetuated because they haven't been recognized as problems, and there are no real tools to actually address them. So there are more researchers working in Indigenous communities and collecting data and samples from Indigenous lands than ever before. There are no standards for recording provenance of Indigenous people's data or clarity on Indigenous rights and interests and where they should be included in existing metadata schemas. And so to address these kinds of problems and recognizing both the failure of law in this area, but also the failure of research to properly account for and take responsibility for engaging with communities, we really developed the local context system. And so it's really a kind of key mechanism to support the inclusion of Indigenous rights and interests in records and data repositories. And in that way, it's seen as a key tool in supporting Indigenous data sovereignty. And Indigenous data sovereignty is the right to govern and control data that is generated by Indigenous people on Indigenous lands and waters, but also data generated about Indigenous people, also on Indigenous lands and waters. So that's kind of one of the key dimensions of what Indigenous data sovereignty is and means. So the local context system has two types of digital tools, and you'll see this in the slide in the kind of top left-hand and bottom right-hand corner. There are labels and notices. And so I'm going to talk initially about the labels. They're the traditional knowledge labels and the biocultural labels. And they really should be understood as digital metadata tags that can reflect cultural protocols for access, use, and circulation of knowledge and data that come from Indigenous local contexts. There are 18 traditional knowledge labels, and the labels are machine readable and allow for community control through customization. That is that the icon remains the same. We had to create something that was stable across multiple countries and across multiple contexts, but needed to allow for the unique expression that every community has the sovereign right to define these terms in their own ways. And so the icon remains the same, and each community customizes the label for their unique conditions. The labels do a lot of work in terms of bringing Indigenous protocols into the management of Indigenous collections and data. And in this way, they enhance existing metadata, and they kind of set community expectations about how this material can be used in future kind of research contexts, for example. The TK labels, or the traditional knowledge labels, were really the first suite of labels that we developed, largely to kind of address many of the problems within archives, libraries, and museums, to address the historical problems of research that continue to affect Indigenous communities. And they're currently being used by over 50 communities in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, Spain, Mexico, New Zealand, Chile, and Norway. So kind of broad reach, because the problem is international. The problem is not just one that we have in a settler colonial context like the United States, but is one that spans the entire research globe. And examples of the TK labels include attribution. This is kind of one of the first labels that communities tend to develop to actually put the right name back to the research. The name that's been missing, the name that was overwritten by the researcher, often a white researcher, whose name tends to live in perpetuity, and the community's name that gets buried in the notes part of the record. We have a label that's a seasonal label. This label connects people and place to songs or to data. Certain songs are not just songs, they're embedded within complex cultural systems. Some songs should only be sung at particular times of the year. That information was never recorded and is not embedded in the record. And we have a culturally sensitive label as well that recognizes that there are certain sensitivities around the data or around the knowledge that was never properly thought about when it was recorded. This means that there are certain kinds of sensitivities in relationship to having access to those materials and just generally changing the care for these collections, and that care requires thinking about how these collections were produced in the first place, with what consent and under what conditions. The biocultural labels are a newer initiative, and they're really largely extending the traditional knowledge labels into the sciences, particularly genetic and genomic sciences and data-driven science contexts. And like the TK labels, the biocultural labels connect protocols to data. There are 6 biocultural labels that we've developed. There's a provenance label, a consent verified label to talk about the conditions of consent in the research process. There's open to collaboration, indicating communities' willingness to continue collaborating with researchers in the future. There's an open to commercialization label to help researchers know that the community is actually open to thinking about commercialization options and expecting benefit sharing that might derive from particular kinds of research. There's a multiple community label, recognizing that the obligations and responsibilities stretch across multiple communities, not just embedded in one community. And there's also a research use label, indicating to researchers that from the community standpoint, this data is open to be used for research. So as we've built this system, it's also become clear that we needed separate tools for researchers and for institutions. So the labels are really community derived and developed tools. And then we have the notices that support researchers and institutions to develop better practices around transparency and integrity in research process. And so that we have the traditional knowledge and biocultural notice, and we have the cultural institutions notices. And they're distinct interventions in the sense that they're applied by researchers and institutions to indicate that there are Indigenous interests in data and samples that have been collected. The notice is used as a placeholder on a collection or on data or in a sample field or metadata until a community developed label is added to replace it. And the notices, you know, part of the imperative there is that we know that researchers do want to do the right thing. They do want to do the right thing by communities. They just rarely have the tools to do that. And in this instance, we developed the notices to support that transparency and integrity at a research level, promoting engaged and transformative practice. This is an example of the traditional knowledge labels that have been incorporated into the Library of Congress. We were working very closely with the Passamaquoddy tribe in Maine. These are wax cylinders that were recorded in a research experiment, a sound research experiment that involved the Passamaquoddy in 1890. But the Passamaquoddy were never involved in updating this record. They actually never received the sound recordings until 100 years later anyway. And now that they've had access to these recordings, they've added 3 labels that indicate not only Passamaquoddy rights and interests, but ongoing Passamaquoddy authority over these recordings. And so they chose to use 3 labels. They've used the attribution label to put their name back in the Library of Congress record. They've used the non-commercial label to say that under no circumstances should these recordings be used in commercial contexts. And they've also used the outreach label, the label that indicates that they've chosen these recordings to help educate non-Passamaquoddy people about the Passamaquoddy community, that they've been involved in making that decision. What the key elements of this kind of intervention does and has had is that the labels do a lot of work in terms of transforming the records. In this instance, the MARC record, adding Indigenous rights back in at a kind of digital infrastructure level. It's been involved in kind of transforming the digital infrastructure in terms of the JSON capabilities at the Library of Congress. So now all items in the Library of Congress have a JSON field for traditional knowledge, or traditional knowledge labels, which is a huge intervention. So that means that any community can add TK labels at the Library of Congress. And then also, thirdly, changing rights recognition. If you go into this record and you look at it more clearly, you'll find that the TK labels under the rights field come up first before the copyright holder's rights. And in that sense, these labels are marking that these rights that the Passamaquoddy have are the first rights. They remain the first rights. The Passamaquoddy remain and retain the authority over these sound recordings. They're their songs. And they're generously providing them for people to understand and learn from, but under the right conditions. And I think that's a really important part of what those labels are doing within the Library of Congress for the Passamaquoddy community. The second example that I want to just briefly touch on is the notices. This is an example from the Environmental Protection Advisory in New Zealand. This was added by the Chief Science Advisor, testing the use of the notices in the Open Waters Aotearoa Wilder Lab. And in this sense, this is an example which is directly one community or iwi who's added the notices to the eDNA records. And the notices here function as additional metadata at the record level, indicating that there are rights and interests that need to be taken into account in any kind of future research that might draw upon this data. So just as a final note, like the local context system, as we've developed it, is really designed to promote and support Indigenous rights and interests and ongoing responsibilities to knowledge and data recorded by and about Indigenous people. In that sense, the goal is to keep these interests with this data for future generations. And on that, I'll finish and look forward to our conversation.
That's great, Jane. Thank you so much. So we have heard about a range of amazing uses of citizen science and considerations about the intersection between communities and science. So we've heard about this sort of notion of braiding together different perspectives, not too tight, not too loose. We've heard about how we tag data so that it takes the provenance of where that data comes from. We've talked about communities that are so differentially impacted and how do you partner with those communities. And we've talked about scale, right? We've talked about everything from galaxies to water quality, but we've also talked about projects that have just a few people in them to projects that have hundreds of thousands in them. So as we think about that and that range of possibilities, I wonder if you could each speak to how citizen science can be used to be a part of the response in a moment of crisis, in a moment of reckoning like we're having in our country right now. And what are some things on your mind about this moment and about using citizen science in these kinds of moments? And I'm going to ask Elena to go first because I've heard her talking about one really interesting example, and then we'll turn to the rest of you.
So during this COVID-19 pandemic, travel to villages have been shut down, and rightfully so, because even one case would be disastrous. We, in the past, have experienced where villages were wiped out because of an epidemic. And so Katie, who's on my team, Katie Spellman, is also co-lead on another project that is collaborating with our NASA project, and it's called Fresh Eyes on Ice. And during breakup time, this is what we call when the snow, the ice, river ice and lake ice break up, and we need to be able to predict what might happen so that they could be mobilized, the communities could be mobilized to do whatever they need to do to get out of danger. And so usually the National Weather Service personnel would go out to the villages before and during breakup time, and so put it in their prediction models. And so how spring breakup conditions might adversely affect and how to prepare for it. And so because they could not travel to the villages, then they actually had to use citizen scientists from from our project, our NASA project, and also from the NSF project, Fresh Eyes on Ice. And so so it was a call to the citizen scientists already embedded in the communities to be doing the observations and then sharing their observations with the National Weather Service.
That's great, Elena. And yeah, I really appreciate also, it's a great example of clearly serving the village's needs, the citizens' needs, right, in that moment. Sacoby, do you have something you want to add?
What we struggle with our citizen science work is, how we engage our partners during this virtual situation. So we had some trips planned to do some work in person with communities in Charleston and Savannah that had to be delayed or canceled. Some work planned with folks in Houston, Texas, because I do work in Houston as well with EDF and some community partners on the ground. And so we just transitioned to doing virtual engagement. So we had some virtual trainings that we've done just to continue to stay in contact and continue. The thing about relationship building, you build a relationship, you also have to maintain a relationship. So even under these situations, you still have to have activities and keep that communication going. So we actually did a retreat with our partners in Savannah, and we had like a 2-day workshop on air quality monitoring over a period of 4 hours over a period of 2 days. So that was like a 1 week of activities, and then with our partners in Houston, Texas, working with EDF, we working with 4 community groups dealing with various environmental health issues. One community is dealing with a creosote cancer cluster. You may have heard of that community in the 5th Ward in Houston. Another community that's dealing with a lot of air pollution associated with traffic. If you know about Houston, the Houston Ship Channel is one of the largest petrochemical corridors in the world. And so, but we did a workshop for a 2-day workshop with those partners with air quality again. And then we had 2-hour consultations with them to go through like their needs assessment plans and how they can translate those needs assessments into action plans. And so the reason why I bring it up is an example. When you're working with frontline and fence-line communities, I think it's important to continue to build, but also one of the things that we learn out of that work is and then under COVID-19, these are some of the same communities that I'm working with that have environmental justice and health concerns that have been hit hard by COVID-19 too. So the sort of responsibility and accountability as a partner has been sort of increased because we still have to be there to serve. How do you use research and citizen science to serve communities? And I think that's an important sort of note or ethic that I want to share. That's my ethos, using research to serve. And particularly when there's really dangerous situations like what they're going through now.
Such a great point, and I love that idea of research in order to serve. It's a great piece for sure. Thank you, Sacoby. Jane, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this particular moment, not only are we forced to kind of think about the histories and actually have a reckoning in relationship to who and what and how particular kinds of knowledge gets valued, but there's an opportunity to incorporate tools that shift and transform practices in ways that previously were unconsidered. And I think, looking at certain kinds of principles that are coming out of multiple community contexts, just in terms of how research and participatory research and transformative research engages with what the needs are of communities in this moment is going to be critical. I think that also I would point people to some of the emerging principles around supporting Indigenous data, for instance, the CARE principles, which are largely around the collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, and working out dynamic ways of incorporating those kinds of principles into research projects themselves, not as afterthoughts, but as core foundational principles that allow research to really become and be and serve and support and make sure that communities are involved in from the very beginning. And I think that's where I'll leave my comment.
Thanks, Jane. Laura?
Picking up a thread from what Sacoby was saying about during this time of physical distancing, it's just been because we have these discussion forums and all the projects, it's been a wonderful place to see just how an online space can continue to provide community and a way to connect, and just how keen people are to connect during this time and be part of something bigger and engage in something meaningful and have impact when they can't physically leave their homes as we have been. And I've also been thinking about, through the just panelists' different phrasing, in the first webinar of the series where Raj Pandya talked about how it is mainly about complementarity of expertise. And when you think about the bus and who should be on the bus, and having a scientist on the bus and having the tools and easy to use and useful tools on the bus, but the scientist doesn't need to be the one driving that bus. And that's very much in line with how we think about tools like Zooniverse, is how can we, one, potentially just provide a space for people to start building comfort level and confidence in being in a space with researchers, in a space that's very deliberately designed to be a supportive and welcoming space. And then more so, going back to some of the things I said of how can platforms like Zooniverse, more broadly, spaces like NASA, show up in places and listen to what the community's needs are and be in service to those needs, and let that drive the agenda.
That's a great point, Laura, and it makes me think ahead a little bit to one of the series workshops that's coming up on data mashups. I'm thinking about how NASA satellite data might actually be able to sort of superpower citizen science and community-derived and community-defined data in ways that actually empower that data. So it'd be interesting to think about that as we go ahead.
This has been a fascinating conversation and an incredible panel that you pulled together, Leigh.